welcome. Happy Monday, everyone. Welcome to today's Midwest Cask Science Seminar. My name is Olivia Ledee. I'm with U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm the acting director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. You will hear CASC as our abbreviation for the presentation today, if you haven't learned that already. We're excited to be hearing from a panel of speakers today talking about climate impacts and natural solutions in Midwest cities. A few things before we get started. We're recording this, so if you don't want to be visible, turn your video off and please stay muted. The recording of today's seminar will be shared with registrants via email and will be on our YouTube channel. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout. Really appreciate that conversation. So we're going to share, Lucinda's going to share a brief introduction to the Midwest Cask and a few announcements. First, Jess, announcements? Oh, okay. Sorry, order. First, a little bit of background on Midwest Cask. We are a federal university partnership with 9 institutions in the region hosted by the University of Minnesota. We're part of a national network of 9 CASK, which work to produce science that can inform natural resource and cultural resource management to help fish, wildlife, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And we do that work through a variety of ways. We conduct synthesis research on topics relevant to our 5 regional priorities. We support a network of postdoctoral fellows and graduate students. We run a tribal undergraduate research program through our partner College of Menominee Nation. We host capacity building workshops and an annual gathering of our community every year. And then we fund research projects and promote new collaborative partnerships through an annual allocation of research awards. And with that, now I'll turn it over to Jess.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm Jess Delfiaco. I'm the communications manager for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I just wanted to share a couple big announcements that we have this month. First of all is that, as Olivia just mentioned, we have an annual gathering each year, and we now have our date and place set for this year's gathering. It's going to be August 14th through 16th in Indianapolis. So I hope you will put that on your calendars so you can join us there. More information will be coming out soon as we get planning going for that. And secondly, very exciting announcement in that we now have a Midwest Cask website, which has news about our projects, our resources, upcoming events, all good stuff that you can find there. And we are excited to have that up and going so we can communicate with you all about our work. So please go ahead and check that out after our presentation today. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Lucinda Johnson to introduce our speakers and get us going.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our regular science seminar. Today, we're going to be focusing on climate adaptation, use of natural climate solutions as they relate to cities. We have 3 panelists. I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly, and they will expand upon interests and qualifications when they give their little introductory talks. First, I'll apologize because it's snowing like crazy up here in Duluth, and my satellite is a little bit wonky when it does this, so I'm may freeze once in a while, and if so, I'll ask the speakers and Jess to please carry on, and I will catch up on the flip side as I can. Hopefully those interruptions won't be too long. So we'll have 3 speakers today, Dr. Sarah Hobby from the University of Minnesota and the Minneapolis-St. Paul Metropolitan Area Long-Term Ecological Research Program. Dr. Asia Daunton from the Michigan State University and the Michigan Urban and Community Forestry Council. And Dr. Scott Collis from Argonne National Laboratory and the Community Research on Climate and Urban Science program. So we will have a very short presentation from each of our three speakers, and then we will open it up for questions. I have some questions that have been posted already. Please feel free to add questions to the chat as prize. So Sarah, would you like to start, please?
Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So I'm going to talk about a very new project, so mostly aspirational thoughts rather than results. But this is a new long-term ecological research program centered in the 7-county metro area of the Minneapolis-St. Paul. I'm just getting over COVID, so my voice is not great. I apologize for that. So hopefully you can hear me and understand me. So just to give you an idea of what we're about at the MSPLTER, our overarching goal is to understand how people and urban nature interact in cities. And we're interested both in understanding how urban ecosystems respond to environmental stressors and rapid social change. But we're also interested in using that work to inform approaches to addressing inequities in who benefits and who is burdened by urban nature towards improving environmental outcomes for all residents. So we're exploring urban nature at a range of scales, from individual organisms up to habitat patches, to drainage networks, to landscapes. And we're also trying to understand decision-making and governance and policy and practice in the urban social system at a range of scales, from individuals to groups to municipalities to the entire metro region. And as I said, we're ultimately interested in how governance, policy, and practice around urban nature influences who is burdened by and who benefits from urban nature, towards trying to make those benefits and burdens more equitably distributed. So in the Twin Cities Metro, if we're thinking about climate change, some of the most relevant attributes of climate change include increases in mean annual temperature, increases in summer precipitation, and increases in heavy precipitation events. And these are compounded by characteristics of cities, including the high impervious surface cover that we see in cities and the high drainage densities that we see in urban drainage networks. And what I want to do today is just highlight a few different studies that we're doing. They're at sort of various stages of initiation that really do focus on climate change specifically. So the first study that I'll highlight is a study that's led by Leslie Brandt and Rebecca Montgomery and others, asking how can we best manage urban forests in the context of climate change. And this study focuses in particular on urban floodplain forests along the Mississippi River. These forests in the Twin Cities have been hit particularly hard by emerald ash borer. So we have a lot of ash mortality. And so the goal of this project is to really think about how can we manage regeneration in these forests in a changing climate. And so these are three different pieces of art, posters that were created by an Indigenous artist, Willard Mailbear, that really illustrate the three potential management strategies that are being explored in this experiment. So the first one is focused on resistance. So the goal of this strategy is to maintain the present composition of the forest by promoting regeneration of species that may not have very high levels of natural regeneration. So this is really focusing on species that are exemplified by cottonwood that are currently present in the forest, but might be rare because of limited regeneration. The second management strategy focuses on resilience of the forest. So the goal here, the management goal, is to help forests withstand extreme events. The species that are planted in this treatment are exemplified by bur oak, which these are native species, but that are particularly tolerant of extreme conditions, including flooding and drought. And then the third management strategy, the third treatment, is focused on transition. So the goal here is to actually manage these forests for change. And so in this treatment, folks have planted species and genotypes that are currently present in large abundance just to the south of this experiment. So this is actually a multi-decadal experiment. So it was just initiated a couple of years ago, but the plan is to follow these treatments over the long term. The second study that I want to highlight is a study that is also focused on the urban forest. So we're very interested in urban forests because of the many benefits that people obtain from urban forests in the city. And so this study focuses on how urban forest vulnerability to climate change relates to social vulnerability. And this is a study that has been led by a postdoc, Adrian Keller. What Adrian has done is basically to gather as much inventory data as she can on the urban forest. And so most of these tree inventories are coming from municipalities. She's collected over 30 different inventories and compiled them into a single data set. You can see that most of these inventories are focused on street trees, although there are some inventories from parks and residential lands. And so then what she's done is basically with this database, she's assigned a climate vulnerability information to these different species based on a framework that was developed by Leslie Brandt and her colleagues. And so Leslie and colleagues developed a vulnerability matrix for species that are commonly grown in urban systems up in the Midwest, based on both their climate suitability under future climate, so their hardiness zone, and then also on information about their adaptive capacity to things like drought and insect pests. And so these species then that are within this database can be assigned a vulnerability score, basically from low vulnerability to high vulnerability. And so this shows the intersection of climate vulnerability versus social vulnerability. So the map on the left just shows in red the census tracts that have over a third of the trees in the inventory from that tract vulnerable to climate change based on this climate vulnerability matrix. And then on the right, we see the overlay of census tracts that have both high vulnerability to climate change as well as high social vulnerability, according to the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. So you can see that there are a number of communities that not only have high climate have a high climate vulnerability of their urban forest canopy, but also have high social vulnerability, which means that they probably have limited capacity to address the vulnerability of the urban forest to climate change. The next project that I want to highlight is focused on understanding the interactions between climate change, management, and land use and lake characteristics in influencing long-term water quality trends. And so this project is very much in its infancy, but I want to point out, so the focus of this is to actually try to amass all of the long-term data that exist for urban lakes in the Twin Cities metro. There are a huge number of different entities that are collecting long-term data on urban water bodies, and not all of those data have been synthesized in a way that allows comparison across them. And so what we've been focusing on is to actually try to build this database. And so right now we have about 100 or 500 lakes that actually have long-term data sets, some spanning as many as 5 decades. And so these lakes are all experiencing climate change. They have diverse characteristics in terms of lake depth, lake size, mean residence time of the water, et cetera. They also have diverse land use in their drainages, and they also have received diverse management. And so just as one example of that, I've indicated the lakes that have been treated with aluminum sulfate, alum, to reduce phosphate concentrations versus those that have not. And so we're hoping then eventually to be able to understand the variation that we see in lake water quality trends. So this is just an example of two different lakes. So this is lake phosphorus concentrations, an important contributor to impaired water in this region. And you can see the lake on the left was treated with alum in about 2015. And you can see there was a marked reduction in phosphorus in response to that alum treatment. On the right, we have another lake that actually was never treated with alum, but we are also in that lake seeing a gradual decline in phosphorus concentration. So we're really interested in trying to understand the relative importance of things like climate change versus other potential management strategies that have been put into place in this watershed versus other factors that might be contributing to these trends. And then the final example that I'll give is a study that's been focusing on how rainfall intensity interacts with nature-based management to influence hydrology. And this is a study that's been led by a graduate student, Shating Chen. This is the modeling study. So Shating's been using a stormwater network model to explore these interactions. And so this is output from her modeling exercise. The top two panels represent peak flow rate at the outlet of these drainage networks, and the bottom two panels represent total flood volume. And so she's been exploring the effects of differences in rainfall intensity, interacting with the percentage of the nodes in this network that had green infrastructure implemented. And so what you can see is that at low rainfall intensity, green infrastructure is important in reducing peak flow rates. And so green infrastructure is working together with gray infrastructure to reduce peak flow rates. But at high rainfall intensity, the green infrastructure is overwhelmed. There's no effect of the amount of green infrastructure in the network in influencing peak flow rates, but green infrastructure contributes capacity to reduce flooding. So those are just a few examples of the kinds of work that that is underway in our project, but I'm happy to answer more questions when we get into the panel part of this presentation on what we're doing as part of this new project.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I'm glad you're feeling better. Your voice is out really well. Okay, let us move on to Asia.
All right, I'll just tee up my slides. And I think honestly where Sarah left off it actually makes for a nice transition to what I'll be talking with you all about today. I'm going to talk more from a high-level overview of the principles that guide the work that we do in my research group, and then just leave off with a brief insight, if you will, into some of the data that we've been collecting and projects that we're going to be getting off the ground in Detroit this field season. But thank you all for the invitation to speak with you. My name is Asia Doughton. I'm an assistant professor in the forestry department at Michigan State University. And my work is broadly in urban and community forestry, but I really focus specifically on the physical tree traits of urban trees and how they can contribute to trees aiding in stormwater mitigation at the local urban scale. So we're probably all familiar either with this figure or with what it tries to convey, and that urban trees do provide a wide array of benefits to our urban residents and our cities overall. And just from a residential perspective and looking at the people who comprise our cities, We know that when there's a greater abundance of urban trees, there are direct benefits to human quality of life, with impacts on mental health, physical health, reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, reduced risk for respiratory illnesses as well. But the presence of urban trees also contributes significantly to environmental quality in and around our cities. Some of those health-related benefits that relate to cardiovascular health and respiratory health are stem from the fact that trees contribute to reducing airborne pollution. But on the ground, there is a significant contribution that trees do make with respect to helping to mitigate stormwater. And so my work looks into what are the mechanisms by which that particular ecosystem service is provided by urban trees. And I'm most interested in looking at this at a more fine scale view, really thinking about how do physical traits of trees vary between species or among species, and then throughout the lifespan of a given tree. And as we see these variations in these physical traits, how does that impact the degree to which a given tree or trees comprising full urban tree cover in a municipality, how do those variations in traits determine spatial variability or temporal variability and the capacity of that urban forest to contribute to stormwater mitigation? I do a lot of work into quantifying those variations, and we'll talk about what some of them are. And then from there, try to look at the direct applications. So if we know that these variations exist, if we're able to quantify them, and then we can link them specifically to direct decreases in urban stormwater, then can we use that as a justification to be all the more strategic in how we select our urban trees and how we care for them if we want to optimize stormwater mitigation by the urban tree canopy? So all of this work is based on what I always like to refer to as the 3 above ground potential fates of precipitation that may fall on an urban forest, looking at those specifically as interception, or precipitation that's captured in the crown and evaporated back into the atmosphere before reaching the ground, thereby never contributing to runoff in our cities. And then the subcanopy flux of that precipitation, which we measure by way of through-fall and stem flow. Through-fall being that precipitation that may pass through the canopy by way of gaps in the canopy or interacting with foliar or woody surfaces. And then stem flow being that precipitation that is transported to the ground by way of really flowing along the main stem of the tree. So when we think about stormwater mitigation capacity as displayed by urban tree cover, and thinking about that specifically with respect to what can happen with how those trees interact with precipitation above ground, one of the things that's really important is to get out there and measure what we can measure, and then from there sort of back calculate what may be a little bit more challenging to measure in the field. And so in my work, we do a lot to calculate through fall and stem flow. And with that information, in addition to the total volumes of precipitation that we get given any given storm event, we can then back calculate interception and then move forward with really quantifying what percentage of any given rainstorm or precipitation that's dumped during a rainstorm may never make it to the ground. And from there, can we contribute tree cover to that prevention of runoff generation? So that's where I focus most of my work. I want to take a quick second to acknowledge that not all precipitation that falls on an urban tree will be captured by the canopy. There's going to be a significant proportion that does make it to the ground, and there's a lot of work to be done with respect to those infiltration processes, and then water use and the related impacts that may have on stormwater mitigation. For my work, we won't spend as much time today thinking or talking through that, but I want to acknowledge that. So thinking about tree traits and their impact on rainfall distribution, I think it's important to note that there are various traits of influence and that there is a dynamic interplay between these traits. And I bring that up because I think sometimes when we're thinking about utilizing urban trees for nature-based solutions to stormwater mitigation or other services provided by the urban forest, it's sometimes really easy to kind of just want like just one trait, link that to one outcome and then run with it. And knowing the traits is a good starting point, but we do have to acknowledge that these traits, again, change over time with respect to the tree's health condition, its age, and with other varying environmental conditions. And so we kind of have to put the time in to understand the complex interplay between these traits. So I will just kind of briefly give an overview of some of the traits that are of greatest interest and study in my lab, and then talk about some of the impacts. So we do a lot looking at the impacts of canopy structure on the interception process, really linking leaf area to interception capacity, and looking at how that changes, again, really between various species that we may find in our urban forest. Spent a lot of time looking at the relationship between bark characteristics and stem flow, really trying to characterize, bark microrelief, bark texture, and what that means for the capacity of that bark to really absorb precipitation that interacts with it. And being able to quantify what's being sort of stored up in bark material, we can then make quantifiable estimates with respect to how much precipitation is, again, being absorbed by that tree, not reaching the ground. When we combine information with what we know about foliar surfaces, woody surfaces, and canopy architecture to our urban forest, we can then sort of move forward with linking, if we have these specific traits, what does that mean for rainfall capture capacity by our urban forest? And so there are certain physical traits of the crown and foliar and woody surfaces that are attached or connected with increased rainfall capture capacity, including high crown projection area, high canopy density, and then a high surface roughness in our foliar materials. And then there's also physical traits of the crown or of our foliar and woody surfaces that actually contribute to effective drainage of precipitation and not capture. And so we want to keep that in mind as we think about picking trees that may meet the need that we have in terms of wanting to mitigate as much stormwater as possible. And so some of those traits that promote drainage rather than interception include downward sloping branches, low canopy density, oftentimes due to management decisions like excessive pruning of our urban trees, and then lower surface roughness for our foliar surfaces, but also our woody surfaces as well. And so just looking at some of the results from taking all of this into consideration in my lab, going out and really getting field-based measurements, we've been able to move forward with developing some nice estimates with respect to interception and how it changes among woodlots in our cities. So this is just one example of a woodlot from a past study where we were able to quantify that on average, about 27% of precipitation that falls on that woodlot over the course of the year is intercepted, never making its way to urban surfaces and contributing to runoff. And then we've also been able to make some nice measurements that really gives insight into this interspecific variability and how much precipitation is being captured by or stored within the bark of these trees, as well as how efficiently some of these trees are contributing to that drainage of precipitation, which kind of helps us to determine which trees are better contributors, if you will, to stormwater mitigation. So this is just a brief look into Quercus rubra and Quercus, or white oak, I should say. And these numbers are looking specifically at the drainage capacity of these trees. And we see that our red oaks here, just looking at stem flow volume alone, are much more effective at flushing water through, if you will, to the ground, whereas our white oaks, not as much. They're actually more effective at absorbing precip in their bark. And so these numbers kind of give guidance into, again, how individual tree species may be contributing to that capture of precipitation or that drainage of precipitation to urban surfaces. And so this is work that we did, an in-depth study looking at red and white oaks, but we've been expanding similar types of data collection methods to a broader array of species that are more common in our urban forest here in mid-Michigan. And we're looking forward to sort of building out this data set over the forthcoming growing season. From the work that we've done in the field, assessments that we've done of the growing body of literature in this field, my team and I have moved forward with really developing some preliminary guidelines to urban tree selection and management strategies that we think folks who are, in charge of natural resource management in cities can utilize to guide their selection processes, as well as there are strategies for really taking care of trees that really will ensure that species are selected that display these traits that are linked to a more efficient precipitation capturing product, if you will, as well as those management strategies that help to increase that rainfall capturing capacity of our trees. Using these guidelines and some of the work that I've done in teams and we'll be doing with teams here in the Southeast Michigan and Mid-Michigan area, we're going to be utilizing this background or foundational knowledge to work on strategic approaches to selecting, planting, and caring for trees in 6 site types, specifically in the Detroit area. And we'll be looking at how the trees that we select based on those selection criteria, how do they perform in these site types? How can we quantify the contributions that they're making to stormwater reduction, as well as additional services that may be of benefit and of interest given predictions for modified climate in the city of Detroit. So with that, I'll just wrap by thanking my collaborators and funders, and I'll look forward to chatting more with everyone about this in our Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Asia. I think I'm hearing a theme here. Scott, would you like to take over?
Yeah, sure. Let me just share my screen. Hit share. And put that in presenter mode. Oh, and swap displays. Are you able to see my slides now?
Looking good.
Awesome. Wow, this is really cool. I'm thrilled to see so much discussion around green infrastructure, trees, and all the interesting issues that we're also interested in as well in terms of nature-based solution for sustainable and livable cities. Going to be a slight change of gear here as well, because we have kind of a multi-faceted focus for the project I'm going to introduce, but I'll also say, along with the other projects introduced today, we're also very new as well. We're actually just about halfway into the first year of a 5-year project. And for those who don't know me, my name's Scott Collis. I'm from Argonne National Lab, and I'm actually an atmospheric scientist. So I'm also very interested in looking at how trees influence the atmosphere and how trees can also mitigate some of the worst weather we're going to see with climate change. There's a long list of collaborators here, and the actual project list is even longer. The other thing I really appreciate about this seminar, this audience, is this wonderful Midwestern focus, which we very much have in our project as well. So first of all, the project I'm going to introduce, which is Crocus, is really focused around the city of Chicago. One might ask, why the city of Chicago, and why is this a really good place to look at the impact of climate change on engineered environment and environmental justice outcomes? It's because Chicago really is the epitome of an engineered environment. It's a city built on a swamp by the lake. It is, you look at areas around downtown Chicago, the city's been raised up, the swamp has been deswamptified, but as folks know, the thing about water is water likes to move, and there's no holding water back. So the inequalities in Chicago are purposeful and they're engineered. Chicago and the surrounding region is expected to see increased and extreme precipitation, heat waves and flooding and flash drought during a changing climate. Climate projections really tell us we're going to get a lot more of our rainfall in fewer events with prolonged dry periods between. And folks who work with nature-based solutions know that actually has a huge influence on the efficacy of some of the decisions we're going to make. The map you see here is from the Nature Conservancy, and it actually shows areas of high flood risk, high heat, and poor air quality. And they're kind of the 3 horsemen that we really are looking at in Crocus: heat waves, precipitation, and flood, and areas that they're really identifying for taking vacant lots and returning them into nature-based solutions, bioswales, green infrastructure, and so forth. Also of note, 3 target communities that we're working with, which is the Puerto Rican Agenda of Chicago, located in Humboldt Park, Blacks in Green, located in West Woodlawn, and the Greater Chatham Initiative, located in Chatham. We're also working with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. So we're a very different organization, so I thought I'll introduce Argonne a little bit here because we're not part of your Climate Adaptation Center. So Argonne is a Department of Energy Office of Science National Laboratory. We're what's known as a federally funded research and development center. I'm actually employed by the University of Chicago Argonne LLC, so I'm not a Fed, but we really work to our federal counterparts and meet the needs of the Office of Science and beyond, including us, which is a biological environmental research program. We have just on 3,500 employees. We're located in the leafy suburbs of Chicago. And you can actually see our home in the prairie right here with some of our major national facilities. Myself personally, we work a lot with experimental sites in and around the continental United States and internationally to really understand climate change and to build better climate models. But of course, that's a very small part of what we do at Argonne, because our initial mission was really in the peaceful use of nuclear energy. So how does this link back to the work that you guys are discussing here? And that is that the Department of Energy, BER, recently took a real interest in the relationship between climate change and urban science. As we know, your climate model has a resolution of on the order of about 50 miles or greater. So a city like Chicago is really a pixel in the climate model, and understanding how we both build resiliency to and mitigate the worst impacts of climate change in a city like Chicago really involves a lot of science in understanding the heterogeneity within that. So to this end, the Department of Energy funded 4 urban integrated field laboratories, or UIFLs. We are one. There's one in Baltimore, there's one in Arizona, and there's one down in Port Arthur, which is on the Gulf Coast, all with distinct science questions in and around the interaction between climate change, environmental justice, and urban areas. The community research on climate and urban science is your Midwest Urban Integrated Field Lab, being located in Chicago. And one thing we're really doing is developing the playbook for how do we instrument, model, and understand a city, but do it in a participatory fashion. Because doing science in a place like Chicago, the citizens of Chicago, they do not like being studied. So we really need to work with the communities in order to shape our science question and really bring the communities along. You can see this figure here, which shows in blue is your traditional way of doing science. You have a science question, and you then you go out, you build a model to try and help answer that science questions. You inform that model by observations. You have a feedback loop to do this model-driven experiment kind of thing. You write a bunch of papers. It's all good. You get then your renewal of funding and life is good. Crocus pushes that even further, where we actually work with areas in Chicago with the 4 communities I mentioned before. We actually work actively with them to tailor our science questions. We go out and ask them, or not only ask them, but they're actually in our science groups to help really refine what we're looking at. And we actually have translators in our group to help communicate the science, but also communicate the needs of the communities back to our science community. We have a active education and workforce development group as well that is doing things like citizen science, working with the community colleges of Chicago, Chicago school districts, in order to bring some of the science we're doing into the classroom as well. And furthermore, we're actually working with these communities to help tailor our science into actionable plans with them. We don't do that ourselves because we are federally funded. We cannot lobby due to the Hatch Act, but what we can do is provide data to help with really data-informed policy changes and advocacy there. Our Urban Integrated Field Lab, Crocus, is really designed around 10 science questions. I'm not going to read them all here, but what I'll do is highlight the things I think are of interest to this community, because in a nutshell, what we're really interested in doing is using models and observations to answer, not only answer the question of, how good is green infrastructure? We all know trees are good, but what we really want to do is actually understand the impact of nature-based solutions and really the systems engineering approach to nature-based solutions. How much can they mitigate urban heat island impacts? How far away, for instance, from an area of green infrastructure, a newly installed park or green area, does that footprint of heat island reduction go? What's the difference between a black roof, a white roof, which you're seeing more and more of in Chicago, and a green roof, for instance? One area that I'm very personally interested in is how does green infrastructure influence things like the propagation of the lake breeze, which is a real feature in Chicago. And of course, my background actually is an atmospheric scientist and someone who works a lot in severe weather and radar meteorology, is what is the impact of green infrastructure on urban flooding, given that our urban hydrology is so engineered. And I really appreciated Asia's presentation talking about throughfall, and I've been keeping notes there, because for Chicago, it's all about preventing water even entering our combined sewer and stormwater system, because when we get pulses from extreme precipitation, precipitation that's localized both in space and time, because of that combined system, bad things happen. We are using a variety of approaches, and I'll go through these fairly quickly in the interests of time. We use both multi-scale modeling. We use high-resolution model that takes us really, really down to the street scale, working on some of our supercomputers we have at DOE. But the area I lead is our measurement strategy, which has 4 distinct components: a network of 20 sensors across Chicago, looking at everything from precipitation to heat to air quality. We are having a series of field campaigns, and I noticed the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign is mentioned. We're actually taking their Doppler on wheels weather radars to Chicago. We're also working with the University of Wisconsin with some of their mobile trucks there. We have a citizen science component, and really one thing we're really interested in doing is leveraging the vast wealth of public data out there already. In our network, we actually have a backbone cyber infrastructure using this Waggle technology. This is AI at the edge, so computer systems right up against our sensors. One sensor we're really interested in, for instance, is using thermal cameras to look at how different land surface usage influences how much things heat up, for instance. We're also equipping these with advanced precipitation sensors and so forth. So currently we're in our pre-deployment phase. You can see here one of our Waggle nodes and instrumentation there. We have a series of sites selected from amongst our partners and champions, everywhere from the Shed Aquarium to Fermilab to Northwestern University, so on and so forth. Part of the challenge is just the logistics of deploying in a city like Chicago, navigating the politics, the leases and permits that are required. So we're going to be an open science project. So all of our science and all the knowledge we gain will be available open source for everyone to use. But so in summary, Chicago is a city built on a swamp by a lake. The engineered inequality is almost a feature rather than a bug. And we really want to map these out so that the city has the data it needs to chart a way to adjust energy transition. And this can only be achieved if this research is carried out in a participatory manner. So thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to questions.
So much to all 3 of you. There's some really interesting comments and commentary and questions in the chat, so I encourage you to keep track of that. We don't have a ton of time left for questions, so in the interest of connecting the dots between our urban systems and our non-urban systems, I'd like to ask one question of all 3 of you. We've identified heat waves, increased precipitation, and intensity of precipitation as key challenges associated with climate change in urban areas. And all 3 of you have talked a little bit about various strategies for mitigating or adapting to some of these impacts. I'd like to know whether there are specific practices that could be implemented in both cities or in the rural areas into the more natural areas surrounding cities. And are there any downsides to some of the practices that you all have discussed? And I'll take it in order.
I think I must be first. I think Lucinda froze on my screen, but I mean, I think one parallel between the agricultural regions of the Midwest and cities is that in both cases, we've engineered a dense drainage network, either through tile drainage or through the construction of dense storm drain networks. And so in both cases, the goal is to move water as quickly as possible off of the landscape. And in both cases, I think that you have this detrimental, potentially detrimental side effect of not only moving water off the landscape quickly, but also moving nutrients, pollutants off of the landscape. And you also change downstream hydrographs and can make them more destructive. And with increasing precipitation and increasing intensity of rain events, that gets amplified. So, I think in both cases, we can think about strategies for slowing water down on the landscape and trying to restore, drainage features higher up in the landscape to try to prevent some of the movement of water, downstream in such a rapid fashion. And that's going to look really different, obviously, in an urban system versus in an agricultural system. I think in both cases, you have to be strategic about the locations of those, whatever, if it's a restored wetland in an agricultural setting, or if it's, some kind of stormwater feature in an urban setting. The location is important. I think the constraints on where things are located are different in urban versus rural landscapes. One thing I would say, I think in response to your second question, Lucinda, I think I mentioned something in the chat. It was great to hear Asia's presentation, and I think there's some confusion out, and especially among practitioners, that, at the one hand, we're saying trees are good for stormwater management. And then on the other hand, we've been doing a lot of work showing that trees can be important sources of nutrient pollution to stormwater. So, trees can be bad for stormwater and also good for stormwater, depending on whether you're talking about controlling stormwater volume versus stormwater quality. And that's not to say that, we don't have ways of addressing some of those trade-offs, for example, through enhanced street sweeping programs. If we're trying to increase tree cover in cities, we may just have to then recognize the fact that in order to prevent detrimental effects on stormwater quality, that we may have to do more street sweeping. So.
Thank you. Asia?
Yeah, I think I would be in full agreement with what Sarah had mentioned, and one of her statements made me think about it's a saying that's very common in urban forestry, but I think sometimes it's more frequently said than is given the proper thought, and that is the right tree for the right place. And so when we think about any efforts that we may be doing in an urban area or a more natural area, we need to be thinking about the site conditions before trees go into the ground. Ultimately, again, we have these long-term goals of what they will provide in terms of managing stormwater volumes, potentially impacting surface water quality. But if they're not planted in the right location, they are not going to mature and not be able to provide services on the scale to which we are really relying on them to do so. So I think there's a challenge that really comes from even beyond all of the hydrological and other environmental changes to our cities. There's a challenge with respect to the management of whatever solutions we're making. And I think that we really need to be proactive in doing the forward work of understanding our sites, understanding the perturbations that are going to be introduced to our systems because of these climate changes, and thinking about which trees are going to do well given those site conditions and those predictions for climate change. I think to that same point, on the, I guess maybe building on the challenges again, is resource allocation. So in our urban areas, there oftentimes are trees are obviously in places that are just not natural. And so how do we get the right resources to them in terms of water, in terms of nutrients, in terms of human resources that will properly care for those trees again so that they can live a longer life? And so I think, you know, I would really want to highlight the importance of the management aspects of whatever we're doing, whether it's in a natural or an urban area, because without the longevity, all of these initiatives are short-lived and don't reach their potential. And then we have to deal with restarting plus whatever environmental pressures are coming from the changing climate.
And also remind ourselves that tree planting is an ongoing effort. You can't just plant trees in urban areas and leave them alone forever. And disadvantaged communities don't always have the kind of logistical support to maintain those trees in a healthy form. So some of the unintended consequences are that we plant these trees and then they become actually a problem down the road. Scott, there were several comments that were relevant to your presentation, especially associated with how do you know that you're meeting community expectations? Do you want to quickly take that on, unless you want to comment on the other question I posed?
And I can do both, because I definitely want to hammer home what Asia said there. And definitely one thing with working with these communities is that you don't want to overwhelm them, and they do have limited bandwidth because a lot of them are volunteers and a lot of them have really big problems besides our science to deal with. And so with things like trees is such a great example, because if you, and I'm trying to pick my words here, but if you mess up, it's very hard to get another opportunity in places like this. Definitely is a lot of building trust that is required, especially, you know, and I'll be very frank here, with this current administration, and it's focused on environmental justice and its encouragement to get everyone to do so. These communities have had a lot of attention recently. But to answer the question in the chat, so how we do this engagement is actually a science question in as of itself. You know, we have our traditional way of doing things, which is coming in and speaking our big words, talking about, you know, evapotranspirations, biogeochemistry, so on and so forth. And then you're writing papers and not really actually leaving a footprint of our actionable footprint of our knowledge. So the kind of loose answer is we actually have someone properly funded to actually study and understand how this interaction works and how it's effective. One thing we've definitely learned is many light touches, for instance, things like newsletters, and also making ourselves available to them as well, because we don't want to kill them by Zoom meetings, for instance, and we want to make sure that, but when they have a question, they're actually able to come to us. And one of the very interesting things we've seen in Chicago is it's very difficult to come up with sweeping statements about all the communities. They're all very different and have very different needs. So it really does come down to meeting them where it's at. Puerto Rican Agenda Chicago, for instance, they've got their own high school in the region. They want us out there last week to speak to the kids there. Chatham neighborhood, it's all about just how can we tell them how to mitigate the flooding issues they're seeing there, so on and so forth. It's about really listening to the communities and building those solutions in. Switching back just briefly, because this really ties in or not. One of the challenges we see in Chicago with nature-based solutions is gentrification. And it's not really something that we can fix in Crocus, but it's definitely something our communities are very sensitive to. We might build a lovely community that doesn't flood anymore, and all of a sudden the community organization that we're trying to meet the needs of can't afford to live there. anymore. But that's why we really need to provide this information to our older men and politicians in order to make those decisions, about tax breaks, property tax freezes, and stuff like that.
Thanks so much. That was very enlightening. And we're sort of teetering on that point. We have minutes left. Jess, I understand that you'd like to conduct an exit poll. So that leaves us about 1 to 2 minutes for final comments from our panelists. Any final thoughts from either of any of the three of you?
I'll just say I'm looking forward to learning more, especially about the work being done at the LTER and the work on tree through fall. I think things like this are great, and let's look at ways to continue to meet and share ideas in and around these nature-based solutions.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. I think the importance of listening to communities. Mike Dockery's on our project and put a comment in the chat, and so we've been trying to create space in our project for engaging with folks who maybe have not had the opportunity to engage with the university previously, and even have some aspects of the science that we do be quite open-ended, so that we can make room for co-creation and community engaged and community-driven research. So especially working in cities, that's just so important. And because the communities that are being affected by climate change and other stressors the most are often those who are least resourced to address those challenges.
Asia, do you have any parting thoughts?
And just a brief addition to that, I think one thing that I've been learning with our work in Detroit is you have to make space for, like everyone said, like building connections with your community stakeholders and partners. That doesn't always work on the academic time frame, or sometimes even the funding time frame. And so make space. Don't let your work be guided by the clock, but rather by the natural development of those connections and the development of ideas that are going to be sourced by your community partners. Because sometimes their ideas differ from ours and are going to be of much better value to the community.
Thank you. Jess, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everybody. I'm just gonna pull up a quick, oops, maybe I am. A quick poll, which helps us know how we did today. A huge thank you to our speakers. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I know some questions didn't get answered. I'm sure all of our speakers would be willing to answer an email if you were to reach out to them directly. And then just one final reminder that our next science seminar will be in March on the 27th. It's another Monday at noon Central. We're going to be highlighting student projects, student researchers with the Midwest CASC for that one. So I hope you can join us on March 27th again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much to the three speakers. I really appreciate it. Your thoughts were important to the work that the Midwest CASC and the CASC in general is doing. So have a great day.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, everyone.